I learn a lot from my daughter, who is 3 years old. I learn a lot about life. She and I both commute together to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She goes to daycare, and I teach in the urban planning department. We sometimes drive the 1.5 miles to get there, and sometimes we walk. When we drive, it usually is about 10 or 15 minutes faster, but when we walk, Stella really gets to enjoy her experience along the sidewalk. She says, instead of just looking out the car windows from her car seat in the back of the car at buildings and other things that go by, she can actually see the flowers and see all the flowers when she's walking. And so there are real advantages to our walk, even though it takes a little bit longer to commute. She's getting physical exercise. She's exercising her independence. And really importantly, she is having a relationship with her dad. And that's really important to me, too. We experience this together. And it's not the same as when she's in the back of the car and I'm in the front. We're walking together and experiencing that. And so it's a very special relationship. So I want you to think about that in the back of your mind, this pedestrian experience, when I contrast some of the things that we think about when we think of the smart mobility movement. I did some searching online in preparation for this talk to familiarize myself with more about how broad the smart mobility movement is. And there's really some amazing things going on in terms of technology. One of the first ones that came up actually was from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. And not surprisingly, there's a car featured. We're going to be seeing many autonomous vehicles, people not having to drive, but the car going itself. That's a big part of what is shown in terms of smart mobility. It's not just cars driving themselves, but it's being connected with each other and being able to sense each other on the roadway. Connections between the cars and other infrastructure and other aspects of the city, all wirelessly and connected in a way that we've never done before. It's really amazing what's being shown on the internet and what's being done in some of your own research that I hear about. Certainly there's an emphasis on the new types of vehicles that can be sold, the new technologies that exist in terms of electrification and other types of options that are going to get people around more efficiently. Not just cars, but smaller types of vehicles, micro-mobility, scooters, bicycles, electric versions of these, Segways. And then ways of giving people more choices between all these different types of transportation. The emphasis is now on choice. We can find out all the options that may be near us if we're taking a trip through Chicago from point A to point B. We know if we can use bike share or the L or take a Lyft. Someday we're going to have probably a single account that we can pay for all those different services from, mobility as a service. So these things are being developed as a part of smart mobility. And one of the things that's emphasized too in many of these websites is that we're going to become so efficient that it's going to be good for the environment. I think it's kind of interesting that the picture on the right is shown though too. If I were that tree in the picture, I might wonder, I kind of liked it better when all my friends were still here rather than all these cars around me. So there is a little bit of a critical look we need to take at some of the things that are being said and marketed related to smart mobility. Still, I think it's good to emphasize the environmental potential benefits. So I see several themes coming out of smart mobility: less congestion, more choices, better environment, more connection between vehicles and things, which means better safety too. But one thing I don't see emphasized a lot so far is human connections. Where are those walks that I'm taking with my daughter right now? Without a doubt, a new system is being envisioned. And it focused on smart mobility and technology, but how can that still advance while keeping people first? And I've got 5 ideas for how that can be done, and then 4 pitfalls to avoid that I'm going to get to. But I want to talk a little bit of context first to give some background to this. First of all, I wondered, are there some places that already achieve these goals of having less congestion and better environment and more choices for people? Well, I looked on my own campus and I realized there's 6,000 to 8,000 students who come to campus every day by bus. And almost everybody, students, faculty, staff, the 30,000 of us who are there within smaller than a quarter of a square mile, almost all of us are walking between buildings. And it's incredibly efficient. There's a few people bicycling and using skateboards and things like that, but that use of space around the pedestrian movement is very smart. So I thought, well, maybe the Greeks and Romans actually had it figured out way back then. Athens, the streets there, this is still a successful commercial street today, pedestrian-oriented. Rome, same sorts of things. You know, we can advance technology, but maybe there's some good things about what we had in terms of pedestrian-oriented cities to begin with. So I want to emphasize the second part of my title, which is the pedestrian imperative for future communities. I think there's reasons why smart mobility should prioritize pedestrians. So a few of those benefits that come from pedestrians I'll get into, but fundamentally, pedestrian travel is the primary type of human movement. Everything else is alternative transportation. I'm sure in Ron's section next, it's all going to be about things that are not pedestrians because it's all alternative transportation. In policy, we often use alternative to talk about walking and biking, but really pedestrian travel is fundamental because at the beginning or end of every trip that you take to the bus or you take to your car or even on a bicycle, it starts with walking of some form or using a pedestrian assistive device that you may have. You don't have to take my word for it. You can take the State Highway Transportation Agency's advice from the Green Book. Pedestrians are the lifeblood of our urban areas. So even our design guides for highways talk about this. There's a number of reasons why pedestrian travel is so important and beneficial. One being efficiency, use of public space. People take up smaller amount of area than cars, for example. So New York Times Square versus a developing country where you have lots more motorization than there used to be. The spaces that may have been taken up by pedestrians and bicyclists in the past are now getting filled with automobiles, and there are serious congestion problems. In terms of efficiency, the NACDO Global Designing Cities Initiative, the Street Design Guide, provides a great summary of this. A 10-foot wide sidewalk can serve 8,000 to 9,000 people per hour, where a 10-foot lane can serve 600 to 1,600 people per hour, 5 times more on the sidewalk. If we look at it at the road level, if we design a street that's oriented towards cars versus one that's multimodal on the right, the one with cars, 12,300 people a day versus 30,000 people a day. So efficiency for our dense urban areas is really valuable if we're pedestrian oriented. It's no wonder that the National Association of City Transportation Officials emphasizes pedestrians as the primary top priority user of our streets. It's also very important to think of how pedestrian travel is available to people of all ages and abilities. It gives equity. It's an equalizer. Young, old, people who need to use assistive devices, wheelchairs, these are people who are traveling as pedestrians. Importantly, people who have limited resources and may not own a car or even own a bike. In Milwaukee, 18% of households don't have an automobile. So having good pedestrian environments, whether they're pedestrian environments that help access food or jobs or access the bus, are essential for people who don't have those means to also own a car or other type of device. Walking provides great physical activity. It's good for the environment. We produce less emissions than automobiles. Someday, through a lot of the smart mobility improvements and technologies, we will see cars that emit far fewer pollutants. Still, we're going to have waste that occurs from vehicles or any type of mobility. Even the shared bicycles that have been used in China and other places still, when they're done with their life, they become trash. So walking reduces the amount of trash we might have versus other modes. Something that I think often gets overlooked but is incredibly important in terms of the benefit of walking is its contribution to quality of life. And I would recommend to all of you to look at this TED Talk that's by Robert Waldinger. If you go online and check it out, he talks about a study that they've been doing for 75 years of men in Boston. They started in the 1940s, following men who were in their late teens and early 20s. And now, after 75 years, they asked them along the way, well, what makes a good life? And he says, the lessons aren't about wealth or fame or working harder and harder. Good relationships keep us happier and healthier, period. So I think when we walk and when we interact in public space, we get a real benefit. This is a study, graphic that shows some of the results from a study done in 1972 by Appleyard and Lintel. The top street that's shown there has a light amount of traffic and lots of pedestrian interaction between the different houses along the street. The bottom one is one with heavy traffic. And there's far less interaction between the people, far less pedestrian activity going from place to place. And on the top, in those light traffic streets, those people have many more good friends on that street and many more acquaintances than the people on the bottom one. So pedestrian travel and pedestrian interaction and in those types of environments has benefits for those types of relationships. Studies of kids have shown that walkable places where there's more walking going on, the kids are more likely to have adults they know they can trust. For senior citizens, walking has been shown to reduce the effects of dementia or limitations of mental health over time. Of course, so people enjoy walking. There's no doubt about that. We know that even 35% of the pedestrian trips that are reported in our national surveys are made for recreation. So people just do it for fun. But people also enjoy walking to get places. We've done a campus travel survey at UW-Milwaukee, and on the last one, we asked people about their satisfaction with their previous commute, whether it was going to a school or to a different workplace, versus their current commute to UWM. Of course, shorter commutes turned out to be more satisfying for people. Generally, that they're using less time. But when people shifted from motorized to active mode, they were 2.6 times more likely to report that they had increased satisfaction. Walking is a key part of that. That's controlling for all those other characteristics. And I think it's really important if we live in a community where you have the ability to walk to daily activities, work, shopping, social activities, and you don't have to rely on getting into some sort of vehicle or getting on some other device. You are truly independent. And so pedestrian-oriented places provide that. So with all these benefits of pedestrian travel, of course smart mobility and its systems change will have pedestrians at the heart of it. Why would we worry about it not? Well, I guess we look back into history a little bit on this 100 years ago. What happened when we had another major systems change in our surface transportation? The dawn of the automobile age. So early 1900s, prior to mass production of the automobile, streets looked like this in cities. There were shared spaces. Pedestrians pretty much traveled everywhere in the public space. There were other vehicles, yes, but they traveled slowly, and there were personal interactions between them to negotiate that space. The picture on the right is one of the first crosswalks that was ever marked. People had no idea what that was, and there was no respect of that. But over time, the street became socially constructed as an automobile-oriented space. We chose as a society to prioritize the movement of motor vehicles and the efficiency of those over people walking across the street wherever they wanted to. Pedestrians were organized into certain places. That has some benefits, but it also has some limitations to what pedestrians could do. Even though in the mid-1900s, many of trips in cities like in Milwaukee, half of them at least were made by public transit, and at least as many by walking, the streets were viewed as a type of place that were congested, and that was the problem. So we needed to move the vehicles faster. What we ultimately ended up with through engineering standards and planning practices were roadways that prioritized vehicle movement. And this is the modern street that many of us see today in our communities. Pedestrians are at the side on the sidewalk, motor vehicles are moving through. This went along with metropolitan expansion. So during that late 1900 period, so this is showing Chicago development at different stages. From the 1950s to the 1990s, there was a very significant amount of suburbanization. Of course, there was more land accessible because cars could allow people to get further. But as those suburbs developed, for the most part, they were developed in a way that your only choice to travel was by car. Sidewalks weren't included. Nearby things to walk to in terms of land use were not included. You have cul-de-sacs and other things that were oriented towards automobile mobility to get around. It's not shocking that there are people stuck on freeways today because they have to be. They don't necessarily have a choice to commute to downtown Chicago because they're too far away from a train station or from a good transit line. So we made places where life depends on driving. There are some beautiful homes and beautiful yards and places with parks in suburban settings, no doubt about that. But to do daily activities in a place like this, you pretty much have to drive. And so if you have communities where you have to drive and you're dependent on that, that characteristic reinforces itself throughout the system. So you need parking lots for people to put their vehicles to store them when you're going to various activities, which means you need to put those buildings where the activities are even further back from the sidewalk. So if anybody is actually trying to walk in this location, I actually had to, this is in Milwaukee, I had to take 2 pictures side by side to make sure to get the front of the building across that entire parking lot. Think of a pedestrian trying to cross that space. It's incredibly inconvenient. So as this is reinforced throughout the system, other places where walking is convenient in cities and other older communities where walking can be done, they're interrupted by the cars that need to go through there. So you start to develop various norms that exist. Now, it's not legal for somebody to park their car on the sidewalk in Greensboro, but it's socially accepted in certain places. It's not legal to disobey the state law that says yield to pedestrians and crosswalks in Milwaukee, but in many places it's socially accepted as how it works. And there are consequences to these behaviors. When we look at where crashes occur, hot spots, we see them along wider, higher speed, multi-lane roadways in many communities. This is Milwaukee, but most other communities that I've ever looked at look just like this in terms of their pedestrian hotspots. And that has impacts on different types of people. People of color are 54% more likely than people who are white to be killed as a pedestrian. So the safety benefits are not distributed equally when we look at it as a rate per population. That gets us really thinking, what are our values? This is a quote from a tweet that Bill Schulteis of Tool Design Group put out a couple years ago. Your streets are a billboard advertising your community values. Now this picture, the community that's there, I don't think they would ever explicitly have said, well, we want somebody who's riding in a wheelchair to be on a really narrow sidewalk that's poorly maintained next to really high volume, high speed traffic. But implicitly, that's what's being created from their system, how they've developed their transportation. What are we creating implicitly? What are we saying implicitly through our values when we create places that look like this, with no sidewalks, no places for pedestrians to recreate? In some places, we can see that people don't actually like the way the system is developed. Drive like your kids live here. So the good news is, over the last 20 years especially, we have many states, the majority of them, and the majority of the largest cities across the country, explicitly saying we want to increase walking and biking. More than 1,200 agencies have adopted complete streets policies to revamp their streets, basically. It's not just an automobile place, it's for bicyclists, it's for transit users, and especially for pedestrians. So complete streets is being enacted at a very high rate. Roadways are being redesigned, so it's not just a 4-lane roadway for cars and the pedestrians are fending for themselves to cross this. There's now, on the bottom picture in Berkeley, a median island, a refuge, as well as bike lanes. Cities and states are actually asking through Vision Zero policies, how can we create a system that ultimately produces no fatalities, no transportation fatalities? It may be a number of years before we get there, but what does that system look like? So I think there's some potential for smart mobility to complement these efforts. 5 recommendations that I have to keep people first. And I draw from some really neat writings from Bruce Appleyard and Billy Riggs, as well as Lisa Nisenson and Brad Davis. They're worth taking a look at if you get a chance. The first one, improve pedestrian safety by reducing human error crashes. Distraction is a significant issue. When we just look at specific locations, and this is a recent study that came from sites in Northern Virginia, 10% of the drivers were interacting with a mobile phone when they were observed, similar to what Tim was saying this morning. But 23% were doing a secondary activity, so messing with the radio or eating or putting on makeup or things like that. Interestingly, ZenDrive has come out with some data that looks at people's cell phone and mobile device use over time. And so you can see how they've used their devices while driving at different times of day. Basically, this says during a trip from A to B, 50 to 75% of people have used a mobile device during that trip. More, of course, during the middle of the day. So if we look at it that way, the numbers are quite large in terms of mobile device use while driving. And while many people may think, hey, I'm a good driver, I can multitask and do that, you can't. And we have crash data that shows this. Study that's been done of in-vehicle video that's looked at 905 crashes over a 3-year period. 88% involved some driver error. And by far the biggest driver error was distraction. So 63% of the crashes involved that. And the researchers said at a population level, if we eliminated distraction, we could prevent 36% of all crashes. The impacts of those distracted crashes are not equal on all types of users. People outside of the vehicle are more susceptible to a serious injury due to those. And we've seen increases in fatalities to people outside of vehicles, in particular to pedestrians in the last decade. So if we compare 2009, when there were about 4,100 pedestrian fatalities in the United States, to 2016, when there are more than 6,000, that's a 48% increase in just a 7-year period. And that trend has, unfortunately, appears to be continuing. Personally, I take this very seriously. I started in the profession in 1999. The number of fatalities in 2016 was 20% higher than when I started in 1999. So we can do better. And when we look at the types of fatalities that occur and their characteristics, one of the issues is that 3/4 of them occur at night. So I think eventually, with the technology that will exist someday in vehicles to detect pedestrians, we can help prevent many of these fatalities. So those 3/4 that happen in the dark, hopefully cars will be able to sense, detect the pedestrians, and stop before they hit them. 90% of the total increase in pedestrian fatalities over that 2009 to 16 or 2008 to 17 period was at nighttime. And as a side note, people who do use their phones at nighttime use them for longer periods of time during driving. That's what a recent Zen Drive study has shown. So there may be some correlation there between the distracted driving and nighttime pedestrian fatalities, though more research is needed on that. We also potentially could see autonomous vehicles detecting pedestrians in these automobile-centric places where it may be hard to see a pedestrian who's trying to cross the street just because there's so many other things and the road is so wide and higher speed. But this still is in the future. We need much more technological improvement. Last year we had a pedestrian who was struck by an autonomous vehicle in Tempe, Arizona and killed. The technology was not there yet. So we look forward in the future when it's better. Though technology even today exists where we can have vehicles drive the speed limit. And if we have pedestrian activity zones, there's the potential to set speed limits to be low enough that if a crash occurs, it's not going to be fatal or severe. So thinking about using the speed limits and technology together to create slow speed activity zones. The next three benefits that I see through smart mobility actually extend the ability of pedestrians to travel further. There are a number of pedestrians who are younger or older or have disabilities who aren't able to get around very quickly. And with those mobility limitations, they may not be able to access jobs or other activities. Autonomous vehicles may give them that ability to travel more. Transit service can be expanded as well. There are new driverless shuttles that are being added in a number of places in Europe, in the United States, in Denver and Orlando, where it may be prohibitively expensive to provide a shuttle with a driver in a lower density area. But if you have an autonomous vehicle, you can serve that. So for example, there's a Route 61 AV in Denver that goes from a rail station and serves an office park. Fourth, we can increase the number of convenient, affordable transportation options through micromobility, so extending pedestrians' ability to go further by using vehicles that go a little bit faster. Still, these are small vehicles which have relatively small impact on others and take up relatively little space in the public right-of-way. So we can get around efficiently to support the pedestrian travel that's already going on. And the fifth one I think is really important is repurposing space that we've devoted towards automobile parking. The purple in these images here show land that's covered by parking lots in Philadelphia and in Seattle. These are parts of the city. A recent study came out about Metro Phoenix, where there's 4 million residents in Phoenix, 2.9 million automobiles, and 12.2 million parking spaces. Those parking spaces cover 10% of their land area. So imagine if we didn't have to park so many vehicles on that land, it could be used for redevelopment and for other purposes that are more pedestrian oriented. So there's many opportunities in downtown areas like Milwaukee. This is a parking lot that we have right next to our convention center. If that's redeveloped, it could be a more pedestrian oriented space. But I think there's incredible opportunities in suburban areas where you have a mall, for example, that's surrounded by 10,000 parking spaces now. If people could be dropped off by a shared vehicle, or even if they have their own vehicle, have it parked somewhere else a little bit further away, then we can make a pedestrian-oriented space. Madison, Wisconsin has done this. The Hilldale Shopping Mall, when I was growing up, the image shows that there was a parking lot on the right side of this, but now it's being used for something else much more valuable. With less demand for parking on our streets, we can use curbsides more flexibly. So use space for scooters, for shared bicycles. Use that space next to the curb for better bicycle infrastructure. In fact, even use these areas as micro-mobility lanes, so bicycles, scooters, other types of slow-moving vehicles to have a connected network throughout the city. With less focus on parking and more focus on these types of mobility, we can have a multimodal focus to our streets. So changing from the automobile-oriented street on top to the multimodal one on the bottom. Or we could even get more places that are car-free. A number of European cities are really emphasizing car-free spaces, as Copenhagen has done for many years. These are places that had originally been developed around walking. So they're perfect to go back to a pedestrian-oriented space. New York is one of our best examples that has reclaimed space for pedestrians. Times Square in 2009 changed from an automobile-oriented corridor into a place where many more people could access that space. And if you've been there, think of how much more enjoyable it is now versus when there were taxis filling the whole thing. Far more people can enjoy it. So there's more opportunities for these types of car-free activity centers. Of course, we have to do it in a very thoughtful way. It won't necessarily happen itself. So I think there's some pitfalls that we want to avoid. First being, avoid ceding the street right-of-way completely to robots. Now this image here is what I see in several places on the internet that are trying to just show the efficiency benefits of having vehicles that can detect each other. But what would happen if somebody actually tried to cross this as a pedestrian? It's a 12-lane road, intersected with a 12-lane road. That's not a type of place that I'd want to live, and I don't know if a lot of people would. Much of the activity that occurs is at street level, and people want to cross at grade, so we need to make those crossings safe. I would not recommend relegating pedestrians to overpasses or underpasses, except on freeway type places, not in cities where you have an arterial street or a central neighborhood street that should be the focus of social activity or commercial activity. So maintain and improve at-grade pedestrian crossing opportunities. Don't get rid of them or limit them. Secondly, avoid the proliferation of large private vehicles. Now this 35-foot long SUV might be a little bit of exaggeration from the Sheikh in Abu Dhabi, but you could imagine that with autonomous vehicles, there may be an opportunity for people to not really worry so much about commuting for an hour or 2 hours if you can bring a lot of your stuff from home with you and do it along the way. So it takes large vehicles to carry those types of things, and if we see more large vehicles, that requires more space and actually increases the risk to pedestrians. One of the other reasons why we may be seeing pedestrian fatalities increase over the last decade has been the increase in size of vehicles. You can see trucks and SUVs taking up more of the market share. So if we add vehicles, we should integrate smaller vehicles into our vehicle fleet rather than larger ones. Third, we should avoid increasing vehicle miles traveled. So we look at the differences between 2009 and 2016. This is another potential factor why we've seen more pedestrian fatalities. There's just more vehicles out on the roadways. So how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled if we're providing a much more convenient option of autonomous vehicles or ride sharing or whatever type of smart mobility is better than what we have today? I'll get to that in a second, but we know already from the use of Lyft and Uber, they're making up about 15% of all trips within the city of San Francisco. So trips from point A to point B in San Francisco are done by ride-hailing vehicles. And that's really contributed to much of the congestion increase in that city over time. And you can see the areas of the city, if you go on their interactive maps, that have experienced increases in congestion due to those shared mobility options. So how do we avoid increasing vehicle miles traveled? Well, land use is critical to this. This is a representation of the 7-county region in southeastern Wisconsin around Milwaukee and the growth trend, which is mainly on the suburban fringe of our region. But the vision is for something much more compact and redeveloping areas of our cities that had been more pedestrian-oriented, had been more mixed use, where trip distances are shorter and more possible for pedestrians to make. So thinking about how this vision for your land use and community development occurs is critical to reducing the amount of impact vehicles might have on the system. So we need to reduce travel distances through pedestrian and transit-oriented development. The people who live in these condos in San Francisco can easily walk down to the sidewalk and get their groceries at the Whole Foods or many other activities around the area. People who live in the pedestrian-oriented area around Washington, D.C.'s Metro Center can get on the train if they need to go for further distances for those types of trips. People can use bus rapid transit from their transit or walk-friendly development. So you do your daily activities in a walk-friendly area, but then for longer distances, use bus rapid transit, which could be driver or automated someday. And the last pitfall I think is really important to avoid is a pod-based world. People shouldn't have to travel in a vehicle to get around from one place to another. We shouldn't have to rely on a system of these connected vehicles. Even though the potential exists and it will have benefits, we shouldn't force everybody to do this. We need to continue to encourage lifelong physical activity and social interaction in those public spaces. That's where people actually experience the richness of life. So what can you do as somebody in the audience who's a researcher in this area, or you may be a practitioner, a policymaker? What can you do to make a more livable and pedestrian-friendly community? Well, be involved in the conversation. Another recent paper that came out was a survey of people, of practitioners in cities of greater than 100,000 in the country. And they were asked whether or not they thought their city had a clear policy for incorporating AVs on streets. Only fewer than 5% agreed with that. City has a clear plan for AVs, so an actual plan. Fewer than 3% agreed with that. So the conversations still need to be had, and all of you in this room can be a part of them. And so when you have those conversations, ask questions. Will this gadget or technology make life or community better? Do we actually need it? And how can it do that? And then support policies that keep pedestrians and people first. I think this tweet that came from Paul Supawanich was really excellent. Always get a little concerned when the perception of the future of transportation includes a lot of empty pavement and very, very few actual humans. So as we work on the future of mobility, let's keep it pedestrian-oriented and keep people first. Thank you.